Karl Marx remains one of history's most influential thinkers. Marx's most famous work, Capital, is a comprehensive analysis of capitalist production and its inherent contradictions. Split into 3 volumes, with 2 being published after his death by his friend Friedrich Engels, this video will cover Volume 1, simply chapter by chapter. Marx's ideas centered around the concept of class struggle, arguing that history is shaped by the conflicts between those who control the means of production, the bourgeoisie, and those who work for them, the working class or the proletariat. While Capital is a dense and complex work, its central arguments offer insights into the war between capital and labor throughout history and in the world around you today. The book is divided into 8 different parts, each delving into their own area of capitalist production. This video will follow the same layout and recap the key concept raised at the end of each chapter. Understanding Capital requires careful reading, but offers invaluable insights into the world around you. Please do try to read the book if you've enjoyed today's video. If you're new here, welcome to the Left Library, the home of simplified political theory. In the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, Marx starts at the heart of capitalist production, the commodity. He begins with the observation: the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. Marx defines a commodity as an object that satisfies human wants. A commodity, he explains, is an object produced for exchange. It is not merely a product of labor, but one that exists to be sold in the market. For Marx, commodities possess both use value and exchange value, giving commodities a dual nature. Use value refers to the utility of a commodity, like its ability to satisfy a specific human need. For example, a loaf of bread satisfies hunger, or a coat keeps you warm. Use value is tied to the physical properties of the commodity. Exchange value, on the other hand, looks at the worth of a commodity in the market. It is value in relation to other commodities. Exchange value abstracts away the physical utility of the object and focuses on its equivalence in trade. For example, a coat might exchange for a certain number of loaves of bread. Marx argued that use value is inherent, while exchange value is a social relation. A social relation refers to the connection between people shaped by their roles in society. Under capitalism, these relations are deeply hierarchical. Workers produce use values, while capitalists control exchange and profit, creating a system where power and wealth flow upward, perpetually reinforcing inequality. This distinction between use value and exchange value is crucial to Marx's analysis of capitalism. Under capitalism, the focus shifts from use value to exchange value. Commodities are produced to generate profit, not to satisfy human needs. In capitalist societies, this leads to production becoming divorced from usefulness. Marx argues value is a product of social labor, and a thing's value is determined by socially necessary labor time required to produce it. This labor theory of value is central to Marx's critique of capitalism. Marx writes, open quote, "A commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties." End quote. The mystery Marx refers to lies in how the commodity simultaneously has these 2 forms of value, one tied to its material properties, the other tied to social relations in the market. Marx's next move is to analyze the labor embedded in commodities. He identifies a crucial distinction. Labor also has a dual character in capitalism. For one, there is concrete labor, This is the specific kind of work that produces use values. For example, a tailor's labor produces a coat, while a baker's labor produces bread. Concrete labor is tied to the physical qualities of the product. Secondly, there is abstract labor. This is labor viewed in terms of the time required to produce a commodity, stripped of its specific qualities. Abstract labor is what creates value. Marx writes, open quote, "The value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of socially necessary labor time required to produce it." Socially necessary labor time is key here. It refers to the average amount of time society expects a worker to take under normal conditions and with average skill and tools. If a worker takes longer than this average, their labor doesn't add more value. It's wasted from the market's perspective. This abstraction of labor creates the possibility for commodities to be compared and exchanged on the market. From this brief understanding of labor, Marx arrives at a central insight for Chapter 1. Value is not a property of objects themselves, but a social relation. Commodities only have value because they are exchanged in a capitalist system where labor is organized in a specific way. Marx writes, open quote, "Value does not exist in objects as such, but expresses the social labor embodied in them." End quote. This means that value is not about the physical material of a product, but about the human labor that went into its production. To illustrate, imagine two products, a wooden chair and a plastic chair. Their value depends not on the materials, but on the amount of socially necessary labor time it took to produce each. This is why Marx calls value an, open quote, hieroglyphic, end quote, as it obscures the labor and social relations behind the commodity, making them seem natural and inherent rather than historical and social. Marx concludes the first chapter with one of his most famous ideas, commodity fetishism. This concept explains how commodities appear to have value as if it were an intrinsic property, rather than value being a result of human labor. He writes, open quote, "A definite social relation between men assumes, in their eyes, the fantastic form of a relation between things." End quote. This is the heart of commodity fetishism. In capitalist societies, the social relations between workers are hidden. Instead, value seems to arise from the commodities themselves. Take, for example, a smartphone. When you buy it, you don't see the labor of miners, factory workers, or even designers who contributed to its creation. All you see is the finished product with its price tag. This mystification serves capitalism by hiding the exploitation behind commodity production. It keeps us focused on the products themselves rather than the system that created them. And that brings us to the end of Part 1, Chapter 1 on the commodity. So let's round up quickly what we learned so far in Chapter 1, looking at the key concepts and definitions. So if we turn back to commodities, we define a commodity as an object produced for exchange in the market, not for personal use. Commodities have a dual nature, meaning a use value, which is the utility or usefulness of the commodity. For example, bread satisfies hunger. And then we have exchange value, which is the worth of a commodity in relation to other commodities expressed in the market. For example, $2 for one loaf of bread. Next, we looked at value. Now, defining value, that reflects the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce a commodity, with the key takeaway there being that value is not tied to physical properties of an object, but to the human labor embedded in it. Thirdly, we looked at labour and the dual nature of labour in capitalist societies, namely, one, concrete labour, which is the specific kind of work that creates use values, for example, tailoring or baking. And secondly, there was abstract labour, which was labour considered in terms of the time required, making it possible to then compare and exchange commodities. Even easier, concrete labour creates use values and abstract labour creates value generally. Next, we looked at commodity fetishism, which the definition is the process by which commodities appear to have value as an inherent property, hiding the human labor and social relations behind said commodity. A key takeaway from commodity fetishism being capitalism masks exploitation by making value seem like the natural quality of things rather than a product of human effort. In Chapter 2, Marx shifts his focus from the internal qualities of commodities to their interaction in the market. He explores how exchange transforms commodities into expressions of social labor and how money becomes essential for this process. This chapter sets the stage for a better understanding of the role of money in capitalist society. Marx begins by stating that commodities do not exchange themselves. They require human action to bring them to the market. He writes, open quote, "In order to become a commodity, the product must be transferred to another, whom it will serve as a use value by means of an exchange. For exchange to take place, the owners of commodities must recognize two things. One, that their own commodity is a use value for others, and two, they need someone else's commodity as a use value for themselves. This mutual recognition creates a social relationship between commodity owners. Exchange, then, is not just a transfer of goods, but a negotiation of needs and values. Then, as exchange expands beyond simple barter, it becomes inefficient to directly trade commodities. A new problem arises. How do you determine the value of vastly different commodities? Marx explains that this problem is solved through the emergence of a universal equivalent. This universal equivalent eventually takes on the form of money. Money allows all commodities to be compared based on a single standard of value. Marx writes, open quote, "The direct exchange of products gives way to exchange mediated by a universal equivalent, money. Imagine a farmer with wheat who wants shoes. Instead of finding a shoemaker who needs wheat, the farmer can sell the wheat for money and use that money to buy shoes. Money simplifies exchange by acting as the common denominator." Marx emphasizes that exchange value doesn't exist on its own, but emerges from the act of exchange. Through exchange, commodities reveal their social character as products of human labor. He writes, open quote, "The value of commodities appears only in the act of exchange." End quote. This means that value is a social relation. It's not just about the object itself, but about the labor and relationships involved in its production. The price tag you see in a store doesn't just reflect the cost of materials, but the human labor that made the commodity exchangeable. Marx then explores the unique role of money in exchange. Money is a commodity like any other, but it has a special role as the universal equivalent. In a sense, money becomes the king of commodities, dominating all others. Marx writes, open quote, "Gold or silver, when serving as money, represents no longer one single commodity, but all commodities." End quote. This dominance gives money a mystical quality. It seems to possess value inherently, but in reality, its value comes from the labor required to produce it, just like any other commodity. Finally, Marx highlights a critical point. Exchange hides the true social relations between producers. When we exchange commodities, we don't see the laborers who made them. Instead, we see objects interacting, as if they have lives of their own. Marx writes, open quote, exchange value expresses a certain social relation of production, the relation between the labour of individuals who produce commodities. End quote. This masking effect is what allows capitalism to thrive, by obscuring the exploitation and social connections behind every transaction. So, what do we learn in Chapter 2? Chapter 2, Marx reveals how exchange transforms commodities into expressions of social labour. Here, money emerges as the universal equivalent, simplifying trade, but also hiding the social dynamics of production. Exchange, far from being a neutral process, obscures the human relationships that are at its core, paving the way for capitalism to mystify its inner workings. In Chapter 3 of Das Kapital, Marx explores the life cycle of commodities in the market. This chapter, the metamorphosis of commodities, explains how commodities move through the stages of circulation, the role of money in their transformation, and the emergence of capital as a force in exchange. Following this chapter, you'll understand the key circuits of exchange, being CMC and MCM, and why they represent two fundamentally different logics of economic activity. Marx begins this section by describing two distinct circuits of exchange. The first, CMC, standing for commodity, money, commodity, represents the exchange of goods required to satisfy needs. For example, a farmer sells wheat, which is C, for money, which is M, and then uses that money to buy a coat, which is C. In this circuit, money serves as a medium of exchange, a means to an end. Marx writes, open quote, the simple circulation of commodities, selling in order to buy, only serves one purpose: the appropriation of use values. End quote. The second circuit, MCM, which is money, commodity, money, is different. Here, the capitalist starts with money, M, buys commodities like labor and materials, C, and then sells the finished product to end with more money, which we will call M star. The goal isn't to satisfy a need in this circuit, but it is to accumulate more surplus value. Marx emphasizes, open quote, the circulation of money as capital is an end in itself. The expansion of value becomes the driving motive of the capitalist. In simple terms, CMC is selling to buy, which is for needs, and MCM is buying to sell, which is for profit. In both circuits, money plays a crucial role. It acts as the medium that allows commodities to circulate. Marx explains that money isn't just a tool, it fundamentally changes how commodities interact. For example, in the CMC circuit, money facilitates the process of exchanging two different commodities. Instead of bartering wheat for a coat directly, money acts as the intermediary. In the MCM circuit, money becomes more than a medium. It becomes capital. Its purpose isn't to circulate commodities for their use values, but to generate profit. This transformation gives money its unique power under capitalism. Marx writes, open quote, money transforms the exchange of commodities into an independent and self-sustaining process, end quote. Marx points out that the capitalist exchange circuit, MCM, is incomplete without the addition of surplus value, the final M star, which is money plus surplus, and this is what makes this circuit distinct. Here's how it works. 1. A capitalist buys commodities, like raw materials and labor, for a certain amount of money, M. These commodities are used to produce goods, which are sold for more money, which is M star.
The difference between M and M star is surplus value. This is the source of capitalist profit. Marx explains, open quote, the formula MCM star is meaningless without surplus value. This increment, the surplus over the original value, is what makes capital move, end quote. This transformation is where capitalism's exploitative nature becomes clear. The creation of surplus value often involves paying workers less than the value that they produce, hiding this exploitation behind the commodity form. Finally, Marx highlights a contradiction in capitalist circulation. In theory, exchange is supposed to involve the trading of equivalents, equal value for equal value. But in practice, the capitalist circuit depends on creating more value than it started with. This contradiction raises the question, where does this surplus come from? Marx doesn't answer this directly here. He saves the answer for later chapters, but he hints that it does lie in the process of production, not in exchange itself. He writes, open quote, surplus value cannot arise from circulation, for the exchange of equivalents creates no surplus, end quote. This tension sets up the next part of Marx's analysis, where he explores how labour becomes the source of surplus value. So, let's wrap up chapter 3 of Das Kapital. In chapter 3, Marx explores the transformation of commodities in the market, emphasizing the role of money as the mediator and the capitalist logic of accumulation. We looked at the two circuits of exchange, CMC and MCM, which represent two opposing goals. CMC meeting needs, and MCM generating profit. This chapter also introduced the concept of surplus value, which Marx will explore in depth in later chapters.